Katrin. So it's up to you.
Well, thank you, Beat. Thank you for the thorough introduction. And hello, everyone. Good morning. It would be great to see you, but this is not something that's going to happen today. I have to deliver this talk to myself, which is a shame. I would much rather be seeing you and your reactions. So I'm hoping, or I'm looking forward to a fruitful Q&A session afterwards. And it's funny because this talk is pretty much about me and why I care about renewable energy, where that comes from. And Beat has already told you so much about you, but not much of this is going to be part of the talk. Because the talk is about my experience working in energy and also my upbringing, because I think it connects very well to why we have the term Energiewende in Germany and also why I'm doing what I'm doing. And my story, the story that I'd like to tell you, starts in 1980, which is the year when I was born. And I was born in Aachen. And I don't know if you can picture a map of Germany at the time, but Germany is this country, as you know, on the border of the Eastern and the Western Bloc. And then Aachen is like one of the most Western cities you can imagine, on the very, very, very Western border of the state with the name North Rhine-Westphalia. And I was born to parents in the pacifist movement. And it was an interesting time. And because, as you probably remember, due to Germany's location on the map, we were the border between the two forces of the Cold War. And also, we had the Allied forces in the country. So, you know, when I was a kid and I would roam into the woods, I would run into depending on where I went, an English or a French or an American soldier, right? This is how I remember, you know, growing up in Western Germany. And it was the Cold War era. And the NATO double treaty had just been formed a year ago. And the idea of the treaty was that the US would be allowed to station Pershing II missiles in Western Germany. And I can't tell you much about the time before I was born when it comes to the pacifist movement, but I know that from the moment I was born, I was dragged along to so many demonstrations that had to do with these Pershing missiles, with the fact that the NATO double treaty would be putting everyone at a great risk, but also, and this is what is interesting, there is a connection to energy, which will come up a little later. So this is one of the symbols that I recognize and that I remember mostly when I think about my childhood. I brought you a few newspaper clippings because my parents have kept some of them. For example, from 1981, which was probably the height of the pacifist movement in Germany. And you have to imagine that the support for this movement wasn't a small group of, you know, I don't know, progressives or left-wing idealists. It was a mass movement with a support rate of around 50 or more %. And there were a lot of church groups involved, a lot of, let's say, ethical groups were involved. So it was really a mass movement that was, you know, carrying this pacifist sentiment in Western Germany at the time. And you will notice how I'm telling you a very Western German approach to, you know, to an upbringing. I'm not as knowledgeable about, you know, what it would be like to be growing up in the eastern part of Germany at the same time. So whenever I say this is a German view, it's actually a very Western German view. Yeah, so there were so many demonstrations. This is a picture of one of them. And the title is how people were longing for peace at the time. It was one of the biggest issues. And the interesting thing is that the missiles that I started talking about, they were nuclear missiles. So this wasn't only about peace, but it was also about nuclear weapons and nuclear war. And the fact that this was about an imminent nuclear war, this was obviously the feeling at the time, is probably also one of the reasons why we have this big slogan about no thank you to nuclear power. Let me see where we are. So, sorry, I'm still checking out the. I can't seem to be able to scroll through my presentation. Oh, here we go. Okay, excellent. So in 1982, Ronald Reagan came to Bonn as part of a NATO meeting. And I have a picture for you from one of the demonstrations at the time. They were massive. And we lived in North Rhine-Westphalia at the time, so we were very close to Bonn, but also to many of these demonstrations. And I'm sorry that I'm being confused, but in my view, here on my screen, the next slide is not coming up. So I'm not sure which slide you're seeing right now.
Click on the slides. I can click for you.
Okay, but it's inconvenient. Which one is the one that is showing up right now, Leslie? Can you help me with that?
It says 1982.
That's really too bad. Let me try to advance the slides again. Oh, here we go. Okay, well, sorry about this. Okay, so this is another one. It says 150,000 people are demonstrating against US nuclear weapons. And what is happening here is that this is still a very big issue. Nuclear weapons at the time were the issue, but as we're approaching in time, you probably know what is coming up next, or I presume some of you have an idea what is coming up next. Let me tell you though, and this is something that I wanted to tell you, I lived in North Rhine-Westphalia at the time, and you may be aware that this is the area where Germany was still actively working in hard coal mining. And my dad was actually working in hard coal mining at the time as an engineer. So in a way, my parents were not at all conflicted about, let's say, peace and pacifism. But when it comes to energy, I would presume, you know, from my naive view today, that they must have had conflicted views on energy, or at least, or maybe they didn't care about, you know, coal mining and hard coal so much, because maybe at the time, energy for them wasn't an issue. But then what happened next was 1986. And I was living in Marl at the time. It's a small place in the west of Germany. And I remember, you know, that Chernobyl happened. And I was a small kid at the time. I had a little brother. And we were unlucky because we had just washed all our stuffed animals and we had put them outside to dry for 2 days in the sun. And then Chernobyl happened and the fallout happened, and all of our stuffed animals from our childhood were destroyed at the time because it was unsafe to ever use them again. This was at least the information that my parents had. And it was a disaster. It was a disaster. I remember not going outside. I remember not being allowed to use fruit from the garden or from the trees, not buying fruit anymore because we didn't know whether it was contaminated by nuclear waste and radiation. It was a horrible time. Maybe even more so because my parents were, you know, in this pacifist bubble, but I think it was a big issue for many people in Western Germany. And even today, you know, there are restrictions when it comes to picking mushrooms because in some parts of Germany, they still contain radiation. So I think it left a very deep impression on many Germans my age, but also older, when it comes to the safety, the felt or the imagined safety of nuclear power. And I think this is the first time that I remember this symbol coming up at my house. So before it was a movement about peace, but now it became a movement about nuclear power. So nuclear weapons turned into nuclear power as something to overcome. And it's interesting because before that time, you remember maybe, you know, the peak oil time and the Club of Rome limits of growth area. So oil was a big issue in the 70s, but in the 80s, nuclear power suddenly became, or finally became, a broad view issue. And then in the 90s, I have another newspaper clipping. And on this one, the kid you see and the guy, they're actually my little brother and my dad. And they are demonstrating against the Gulf War. So in the 90s, the oil issue was back up on the agenda. This is the Gulf War where I remember slogans like "No blood for oil." So you see how this movement or this, let's say, I don't want to say bubble that I grew up in. The let's say the public sentiment shifted from peace to nuclear power to other means of energy that were not sustainable, that were also connected to economic struggle, war as an economic instrument, and all of these issues to me come together when I think about the German Energiewende, the idea that energy can be sustainable and can actually be a future that relieves us of these economic struggles, of the economic dependency, because many of these things at the time led to the wars that we're talking about. In 1995, I spent a year abroad in the US, going to a high school in Kansas City, Kansas, which is actually a very, very cool city, pretty much in the exact center of the US. And what was interesting at the time was that I was amazed at how people were not as political, how energy and nuclear war wasn't so much an issue. War was definitely a very different issue. Obviously, being brought up in Germany and the US, you probably have a very different view on the military in general. But also, I was so impressed by all these other things, by the vast, from my German view, inefficiency of energy use, but also by a totally different climate of things that you had to endure. For example, tornadoes in the fall. That the US has a strong tornado season, and the tornado season, came back at me at several years later when I was working in energy and commodity trading, and there was always like, are the tornadoes coming up? What does this mean for energy prices? But at the time, we had to hide in our basements in our house in Kansas for tornadoes. But also, never before had I experienced power cuts. So growing up in Germany, power was ubiquitous. Nobody would ever, or at least it wasn't a very usual thing to happen for your power line to be cut or for your power to be off. And in the US, that was the first time that I experienced this as well. So the fact that, energy or electricity is ubiquitous isn't so true even in the, first world countries outside of Western Europe. And yeah, generally, I think it just occurred to me how you can have a totally different worldview, obviously depending on from where you're looking at it. The US world news, the US news first, and then the world news is a different approach than the one that, I think I had seen when I was a kid. Also, generally, it occurred to me that both the Cold War, obviously, because it wasn't imminent anymore, but also energy was not such a big issue. I think the biggest issue at the time was the O.J. Simpson trial, if I remember correctly. In 1998, that was a great time. I moved to Berlin. And in Berlin, I studied electrical engineering at the Technical University. And electrical engineering is a wonderful subject. You can do so many things. I ended up doing more of, electromagnetic theory and antenna and radio frequency stuff. But also within electrical engineering, of course, you can study, power plants and power engineering and all these things. But I need to tell you that, my university at the time would only teach conventional energy. This was in 1998. So practically at the Technical University of Berlin, you could only learn the conventional power system, thermal power plants from nuclear to, lignite and coal and gas or CCGT, combined cycle. This is the kind of stuff they really knew a lot about. Renewable energy was absolutely marginal. I remember it slowly starting a few years later with single courses you could take. And I am happy to report that it is different today. So you can actually get a master's degree in renewable energy from that institution today. But at the time, yeah, that wasn't the case. And I did several things after that. I have, my PhD is in physics, but then after, working in academia, I wanted to switch back to the industry, or switch to the industry for the first time. And when I was looking for let's say a purpose, I chose the energy industry because I thought, energy is something we're always going to need. At any point in my life, am I going to be well employed and busy when I work in energy? And I don't care what kind of energy it is, but we're always going to be using energy. So I started working in the energy industry in 2008. Now, 2008 was an immensely interesting year to be working in energy. And I'm going to show you a graph soon. What I did was I worked for a Swiss utility company, like a very big company, like the Swiss equivalent to a German RWE or so. And I was trading commodities. So I was trading power futures, gas and coal. It was a great time to be doing this because Germany had started deregulating the energy markets around 10 years ago, but it was still slowly starting. So, trading was booming, deregulation was still taking place. So, there were some things you could sell. They were already, there was liquidity on the market. Other things weren't even there yet. The kinds of power products you have today on the markets, like, selling 15 minutes of electricity for next hour. That was impossible at the time. You would be selling 1 hour of electricity for tomorrow, but you would be probably trading more and more of these, long-term products at the time. And also we were trading carbon, which was great because, as you may know, the European Union had more or less just established the first carbon emission trading system. It had started in 2005. And it was organized in trading periods. So it was just at the end of the first trading period and then starting the new trading periods. And we had carbon prices in the range of 35 euros per ton or so at the time. It was pretty immense when you think about what happened the last few years. Okay, so what was happening at the time? Well, let me show you a picture. This is the crude oil price in US dollars per barrel. And 2008 is the first gray part that I've marked. And in 2008, when I started the energy industry, prices were going up and up and up and up. The energy industry, but everything else was booming. We were worried at the time that, oil prices would go up to $200 per barrel or so. And we were actually trading. We're actually hedging oil for $200 or so because we were worried that it would go above that price. And then when you look at the graph, you see that at one point, everything crashed. And the prices more or less halved, at least in the electricity business they did. So what happened? What was happening at the time? Well, there was a global boom in everything. And then Lehman Brothers broke apart, and Lehman Brothers, being a bank in the US, slowly, unraveled that everything else about banking and finance in the US was a huge bubble and was not substantiated by real assets. So everything came crumbling apart. And this was the beginning of the financial crisis in 2008. The energy industry actually fell apart too, because 2008 wasn't only, the financial crisis where all the trading bust happened, but it was also the start of renewable energy in Germany. And these two things at the same time, a conventional energy system that relied heavily on, trade bubbles and also conventional power, and the fact that, renewables were entering the market. And, the whole, idea of financial volatility and high prices can be sustained was really, really a bummer for the industry. And I stayed in the industry for quite a few years, but I do remember that many companies were really losing money. They were really worrying what future business models could be. And I have to tell you that I specifically remember one meeting in my company. We were discussing, let's say, retail products in energy or electricity for the company as a strategic instrument or at a benefit center. And in the end, we after a discussion with many managers, after a whole day, we came up with only two ways to be able to make money in the energy industry. One would be to either sell a really intransparent product or a scam product. These were the only two things we came up with, that would be, any basis for making any future money in the electricity business. And who picked up that idea? I think some banks did, because I think in finance, you still have these kinds of products. All right. And then in 2010, something interesting happened. To me, at least, because, when I just told you that renewables were slowly picking up, I think they were doing this in a rather, inconspicuous way at the time. But then in 2010, finally, the German government published the so-called energy concept, the Energiekonzept. And this was really the first time that publicly announced and, in writing, we would have in Germany targets for renewables, for carbon emissions, and so on for the future. So the Energiekonzept was, for me, the first time that we really laid down an idea of what we consider the Energiewende to be and the target values we had for 2030, 2040, 2050. And of course, many political, let's say milestones had already been reached beforehand. So for example, the renewable energy law is from 2000. So it had already been active for 10 years, but nobody had really ever considered that we do need goals for renewables and we need goals for carbon emission reductions. And I think 2010 was in that respect a very important time. And then in 2011, well, I have a I have a knack for Japan, right? So I spent part of my PhD in Japan. I speak a little Japanese. I really like the country. So in 2011, I had taken 10 days off and I had booked a flight to go to Tokyo in March. And I had a meeting on the weekend. So I packed all my stuff on Friday. I went on the train to catch that meeting. And I was going to fly from Düsseldorf to Tokyo on Monday morning. And then on that Friday, there were news coming around from the big earthquake, the tsunami, and the disaster in the Fukushima power plant. Yeah, I don't need to say that I had to cancel my flight and I stayed at home. But it was another thing that I think left a big impression on not only me, but also very many other people in Germany, Western Germany at least. But at the time, as you know, both Western Germany and the Eastern Germany were already for a long time, one united country. So let me say that I think it left a big impression on Germans. Partly because of the, history with Chernobyl, but also partly because of a history with Japan and a strong feeling of connection. And just simply the fact that, German and Japanese engineers were always very proud of being able to handle anything. And then, this incident showing that some things cannot be handled, And 2011 was the point where, when it comes to the, Energiewende history that I like to talk about in my talk today, the German government decided to finally phase out nuclear energy. Finally phase out, because we had already decided to phase out nuclear at a time before, then we had taken back that decision. I know it's a little strange, but in 2011, the German chancellor started this so-called ethics commission on safe electricity supply. And this commission practically had the mission to legitimize the phase out of nuclear power in Germany for good. And the phase out plan at the time was to be shutting all nuclear power off until 2022. This is a decision that we made in 2011. It was passed unanimously by the German parliament. And I think all of these things are quite important to understand. This wasn't a partisan thing. It wasn't something that was, decided by decree, but it was decided by parliament for good. And it's one of the pillars of the German energy transition, right? It's not only renewables or, carbon emission reduction. It's also the fact that we're deliberately phasing out nuclear. Plus, we're going to be deliberately phasing out coal at some point, but this is another story. All right, so when it comes to my life, I switched from the industry to a different part of energy in 2012 because, I don't know, the time felt right, So I switched to a think tank. This one, I worked in energy policy. And it's an interesting time because this is also when the Agora Energiewende was founded, another very, very important player in the energy policy or progressive energy policy think tank scene in Germany. And I can tell you that at that time, it was all about the renewable energy law and the renewable energy surcharge. There was a lot of criticism at the time that we were setting, the fixed tariffs that we had at the time for renewable energy were too high. They were set, in the wrong way. They were giving the wrong incentives. That the costs, the overall costs for everyone were too high. And we were more or less 100% working on this issue. Like, how can we do this in a better way? What is the right tariff? Who's supposed to pay the tariff back? It was a huge issue. And it was, when you look at it from today, it was only about, the surcharge that I'm paying for renewable energy with my household electricity price is in the range of, at the time, it was in the range of 2 to 3 or 4 cents per kilowatt hour. It is higher today, right? It's in the range of 6 to 8 or so, but it was a huge issue at the time. And the overall question was always like, is the investment sum overall in renewable energy in Germany too high? And at the time, I think it was in the range of 20 billion euros per year. And I remember, giving talks on the topic, and depending on how, how conservative your audience was, they were always like, but I hear it's 20 billion euros per year. That's so much money. And then when you look up, other parts of the German government spending in a year, for example, I like to quote that federal highways are being, you could say, subsidized with, or you could say invested in by a range of 30 billion euros per year, right? So it's, when you consider, renewable energy an infrastructure issue, obviously infrastructure is important, but also infrastructure is usually costly, but it is in the same order of magnitude as other infrastructure measures that we have obviously accepted as something that can be paid out of the government budget, like federal highways in Germany. All right, and yeah, there was a big discussion about relief schemes for the industry and stuff like that. So those were the issues at the time. And now let me jump to today, because there are so many things that, of course, we could be talking about. But what am I doing today? So today, I'm the managing director of Rainer Lehmann Institute, and Rainer is also a person with a history. So I'm showing you two pictures here. The picture on the left shows Rainer in his 20s and 30s when he was an engineer in Berlin, and he started an engineering collective with his friends, and they wanted to change the world. So what they did at the time was they started developing electronics for wind turbines. And I'm showing you another picture of Rainer. This is the later Rainer, when he had started two very big companies that were listed on the stock exchange. They were called Solon and Q-Cells, and they were manufacturing photovoltaic modules and cells in Germany at a time where obviously this found a great support by the local governments, by the potential investors, and so on. And Rainer, unfortunately, he died very young, and he put his money into a philanthropy, a foundation. The foundation started the institute in his name, and the institute is a nonprofit. We're all engineers. electrical engineers, mechanical, or computer science, and we're working on Rainer's mission, and Rainer's mission was always this one that you see behind me. So applying his knowledge to a future with 100% renewable energy. And I think at the time he was thinking electricity, and I'm pretty sure that many other people were thinking electricity for a long time when they thought about energy. But from the work that we do today at RLI, obviously 100% renewable energy needs to be in all energy sectors. And this is also the reason why, as Beat mentioned, I work with the auto industry, and I work with the hydrogen and storage and natural gas industry, because I like to see Rainer's mission accomplished in all of these sectors. And I personally believe that it is a good thing that we're finally discussing all these energy sectors. For a long time, I've worked in energy, but I've only worked in electricity, to be honest. At RLI, we work in Germany, but we also work abroad. Abroad, the work that we do is more related to developmental cooperation, as in, providing energy access to people who don't have energy access today. And in Germany, we both do research and consulting project. And because this is a conference about energy futures, I also try to look into the future for you and see, where I come up with. And I'm looking at 2050. So, and also, for your expectation management, I'm slowly drawing this talk to a close now. So in 2050, my children will be around the same age that I am now, a little younger than this. And I don't have a picture for 2050. I have no idea what their energy future is going to look like. I really do not know. But there are several kinds of futures that occurred to me that I could, maybe spend some time thinking about, because they're being discussed very much right now, and it might be interesting for you to hear my opinion about them. So the one way that I see, I see four. Let me tell you the four futures that I can talk about. So one is the all renewable electric future. Okay. The second one is a hydrogen future, or at least one that, let's say, pleases the hydrogen lobbyists and supporters of today. Number 3 is a, let's say, carbon pricing new nuclear future. And 4 is business as usual. And let me start with number 1. So number 1 would be just the RLI mission, right? So, if RLI says we're working towards 100% renewable energy, I should be able to tell you what this means, right? And when I thought about it, it occurred to me that I can to a certain degree. So obviously, you can imagine 100% renewable energy in all sectors. You can imagine electrifying transport and heating. In Germany, this will be by employing a lot of wind and solar, mostly wind. Internationally, it will be by employing a lot of solar. So it will be a different, I think it will be a different challenge compared to the one in Germany. And it will definitely make use of the massive international potential of renewable energy that still exists. Obviously, I can imagine this kind of a future because, as you can imagine, you can always use electricity to turn it into a different form of storable energy, like, when you use several conversion steps into a sort of a liquid fuel that you can use for even the most, high intensity energy applications. So yeah, I think this is a future you can envision, but you also know that when you look at the IPCC projections, we will still have carbon in our system for a very long time. This is the reason why the panel uses carbon capture and storage in most of their future projections, because they say it's impossible to be switching towards 100% renewable, either so fast or in total, right? So there is still much debate about this all-electric future. The second one is hydrogen. I'm just using this opportunity to talk about hydrogen because it is such a big trend issue right now, at least in Germany, but I think also in some other countries. In Germany, though, it's interesting to understand why we're talking so much about hydrogen in Germany right now. So the first thing about hydrogen is always, hydrogen obviously has different colors when you talk about it, and green hydrogen is good because it's made from renewable energy, and then blue hydrogen and gray hydrogen are made from natural gas and are the most conventional and also the ubiquitous form of hydrogen that we're using today. And obviously people are discussing efficiency issues. So whenever you want let's say a low carbon future, all hydrogen you're using will be made from renewable energy. So if you have to invest in renewables energy anyway, why turn it into hydrogen? Why not use the energy directly? And this is a good point. There are many applications where you can use it directly very easily, like like a private car would be probably an application where it makes sense to use an electric battery. And there will be other applications like a larger truck or a plane or whatever, where probably you're going to need some high density energy form in the future. Hydrogen is also storable to a certain degree, which is interesting because when I started working in the energy industry, everyone was telling me that electricity is the one reason why electricity is totally different from everything else that they're trading, like oil and gas and so on, was the fact that electricity is impossible to store. You cannot ever store electricity. So this is why we have, you can trade in 15 minutes today, because it's impossible to delay power that is being produced by 15 minutes. Whereas, crude oil could be stored for a very long time. All of these things are changing right now, right? Electricity becomes storable, and turning electricity into hydrogen to make it storable is only one way of introducing storage. But it is a very interesting option for long-term storage, and I definitely agree that this is worth looking into. And as I said, there is a very practical use in all high energy density applications. But also, I think we're discussing this also because there is a great interest from several, let's say, lobby or interest groups in hydrogen as a way of, sticking to the business models that they have invested into. For example, if you run a natural gas transport system, what use are you going to put it to in 20 years from now, when we're obviously, decreasing carbon emissions in applications, and we're trying to get rid at some point of natural gas as well, right? So you need something to do with your natural gas transport system. Also, if you're selling very complex internal combustion engine cars, and the complexity, is your business model, because this is something that you have marketed to people as extremely worthy, and people are paying a premium of $20,000 to $30,000 to buy your car. Is that going to be sustainable when, electric cars are all really, really simple, but then a fuel cell car could be more complex, which could be helpful for, for a German industry that is looking for, let's say, transformation pathways. And I think generally the industry perspective is something that many people are worried about. The fact that the German industry itself is lacking a pathway towards carbon neutrality for the future. And this is also one reason why in the new hydrogen strategy that Germany has, we're looking into decarbonizing the industry with the use of green hydrogen as a first step. It's the first priority. We're not looking into cars or heating or anything. We're looking into industrial processes that could use green hydrogen. But I'd also like to mention two things that I find are very important when it comes to hydrogen. And I know this because I've talked to a lot of people, and I've listened to a lot of people talk from the German ministries about hydrogen, and at least from the foreign ministry and from everyone who's working in foreign relations, hydrogen is an interesting, let's say, alternative, low carbon way into sustaining some of the international relations that Germany has as a net energy importer. Because right now, because we're importing natural gas and oil from many countries abroad, that we're interested in, let's say, keeping our ties up, the political ties, green hydrogen could be an interesting replacement for the, for the economical basis of the political stability between those countries. So you see, I'm mixing all these things. It's a technology issue, but then also a political one and an economical one. And I think all of these come together in energy. It's probably one of the reasons why it's such a great field to work in. Okay, number 3, the one instrument fits all energy future, and it's just carbon pricing. We figured out carbon is bad. Let's just put a carbon price of everything. It is supposedly the most economical solution. It is simple, overall, least cost, and so on. Well, what I've argued against this model, because from my understanding, I'm not even a political scientist, but from my understanding, the multi-policy versus single policy debate is already decided for, because of the system, the pluralist society we live in, and the system that we make decisions in, that we can't solve everything with one single policy. And I also worry about, I actually do worry about new nuclear power, just because, if you only look at carbon, you could, you could start arguing that there is a pathway for nuclear energy in the future. And that's not what the German energy transition, at least, is about. So it wouldn't really fit the German way, I think. But you still see a lot of people arguing for this, one policy instrument fits all approach. And my number 4 was the business as usual scenario. Well, business as usual can be, it can be an extremely pessimistic outlook, right? We're not doing enough. We're not doing anything. It's going to be a horrible future for ourselves, but also for the generations to come. But maybe, to make it a more, optimistic view, it could just mean that we're using a mix of very many different political instruments and incentive schemes. So, for example, in Germany, we're using, let's say, an enhanced carbon emissions trading system, either from the European Union or one that we're enhancing for ourselves. We're using carbon pricing on top. We have the fleet emission standards coming in over the next few years that are really going to push out internal combustion engines from the auto market. We have incentive schemes for investments in, our houses, or, someone else's house to, to start tackling the heating sector. And then maybe this is quite a, powerful mix, and also one that can please the different interest groups that are, working on these decisions. So this could actually be something that works. Of course, it needs to be effective too. So it really needs to meet the goals that we have for the energy future of Germany, but also globally, right? As in the, Paris Agreement, for example. But it could just mean that we have found, in a way that we have found the best way, for at least, Germany and Europe to form decisions on energy, and that we can continue with this approach because it's already working and in place, and maybe that makes it one of the best approaches that we have. So, okay, so finally, let me conclude before I thank you for enduring with me. So let me come back to a societal view. So what is on people's minds today? As I told you when I was a kid, I think what was on people's minds was war and peace, and the imminent nuclear war kind of turned into a sentiment against nuclear power, and then turned into a vision for a sustainable energy system. So today, what do people demonstrate for today? there is a very strong Fridays for Future movement in Germany. It's probably in many of the countries that you live in too, which is something that reminds me of those demonstrations in the 80s. But maybe you have a different opinion on this. Maybe you observe other things that are on people's minds today that either make you, more optimistic or pessimistic about the energy future. That would be interesting to talk about. And just as for myself, well, I'm working in energy now. I continue to work in energy or mobility or any of the sectors that for me are now all energy. It's funny because my pacifist upbringing today, it seems like old or out of place today. But I do remember that I worried about these things as a kid. And when I talk to younger people today, they tell me that they worry about the climate. They worry about the climate they're going to live in when they grow older. So maybe there is a connection there. I worry that it's not an imminent threat to people, because that might be a difference to, the fact that as a kid, I was thinking there is a war coming up. It's right next to me, as opposed to there is climate change coming up. And many people thinking, but it's not so close to me, right? It's not an imminent threat to my life. It is either far away or it's far away in the future. So this could be something that is very different and also has a different way of motivating people to do something about it. But it also is a global problem, right? It's something that needs multilateralism and international cooperation. And this might be a similarity actually to when I grew up in. So yeah, it would be great to discuss all these things with you. I am very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrin. We're still waiting. Yeah, hi, Bert.
Hi. Yeah, thank you very much.
You were both there at the time, right?
Yes.
But
yes.
where did you grow up? Maybe depending on where you lived, you probably
yes, that's right. But I think it's a good idea to tell the history of Energiewende along the whole life. But I have to, before we have questions from the audience, I have a question directly to you. Your steps on the German Energiewende. I missed one step, or I missed one point or one instrument. The EEG. I would say the EEG, the energy, how to say in English, energy.
The renewable energy law.
The renewable energy law, and the crucial point of the renewable energy law was the feed-in tariffs, and for 2 decades, for 20 years. So that was a security for every investor to go into investments in renewable energies. And it was a push to build up a completely new industry, the PV industry. You told the story of Rainer Lemoyne, he was one of the pioneers in this scene. But I would say this was the crucial point in acceleration renewable energies. That is what I missed. What do you think was the role of the renewable energy law?
Right. You're absolutely right. I agree. If I were to tell the Energiewende story as a timeline, it would probably be one of the most important milestones, probably the most important milestone. The fact that we started a dedicated law, we started this feed-in tariff system. We were, for many years, I gave these talks where I told everyone that I'm proud that this system was adopted in more than 40 countries all over the world. You're right. It's extremely important. In the story that I told today, my life story, in the year 2000, I was studying to become a radio frequency engineer, and I don't think I even made note that this law was being put into place. And you know what? Because I worked in the conventional energy industry in the years 2008, and so I think not even them really, not even the conventional energy industry really took note of the fact that this was the start of a new era. Because when I remember working, in these conventional companies or consulting for these conventional companies, as I also did for a while, they were overwhelmed by the effect of the renewable energy law that came into place 10 years later or so, 8 to 10 years later, when we really had the first penetration of renewable energy. They were overwhelmed. They had not anticipated how this would change the the wholesale electricity prices and all these other issues. So in a way, nobody really took note of this law at the time. I know it was a big issue for those that were fighting for it for a long time. They were really proud that they had established it. But it came into life in a very subtle way. And then it started becoming effective at the, let's say in 2007 or 8 or so. And then it was finally there, and it really hit me working in the industry at that time, but not so much in 2000. But I totally agree. For the history of the German Energiewende, it is one of the big pillars and also the milestones. You're right.
So, Katrin, we have one question here by the audience, by Helena Solman, and she asked about the focus actually of your research and of your research institute. She says, I was wondering about your institute and its goals around energy transition. You mentioned that it combines different kinds of technical expertise on renewable energy, but also, as you mentioned, many of these issues are political, environmental, and social. And the question is, do you see space for inter and transdisciplinary research, or how do you involve those perspectives in your institute?
Right. Well, thank you. That's a great question, because it lets me elaborate on on RLI, which is wonderful. So, well, RLI is we're a technical bunch of people at RLI. And what we do mostly is energy modeling, and then all issues related to mobility with renewable energies and international renewable energy issues, as I said, as in energy access, electrification, and so on. And but just as I am, by training an engineer, but also someone who has worked in the industry and in in energy policy for a long time, I see the fact that the technical side or the engineering side is only one point of entry into the subject. And then in many of our projects, we try to work as interdisciplinary as possible, or also, look into business models, acceptance issues, and so on. I'm going to give you one example where this comes together really neatly. We have put together a web-based so-called stakeholder empowerment tool, where you can basically look at the region where you live, and then you can use these slide bars and buttons to click on, let's say, where is an environmentally restricted area in the area where I live. Where are houses? What is the if I were to run a perimeter around where people live, what is left for, let's say, installing new wind turbines or so. So it gives you an approach to make, the fact that we're going to be introducing more wind turbines in your neighborhood or in the area where you live more accessible and also more gamified. And it's something that we need, an electrical engineer for, and we need a computer scientist for, so we can do all the programming. And then we would like to get together with a local workshop to co-generate what the software should look like, and then we can run a co-moderated workshop in your area to use the software. And this is where we try to make use of the fact that we do understand that the engineering side is only one side of the equation. But one thing that it allows us to do is to give advice on many of the issues from a technical point of view. And I think that's very important, at least for the German discussion, to be able to say that, we actually have a model that, can tell you a little bit about, let's say, the number of solar PV stations that make sense in this area, or the megawatts of power you can draw from this. And we're very knowledgeable on all of these issues. Like everything has to do with power and megawatts and so on is something that is our daily job. And then everything else is something that we try to do in the projects that we can. I need to tell you that the projects that we do are more than 90 or 95% third-party funded. So we don't have, we don't have funding that we can spend in pet projects, but we need to look out for, public funding, or we need to find a sponsor for a certain project. And in this set of restrictions and requirements, we, try to pursue the goal. And the goal is obviously, the Energiewende by any means.
Yeah, this is another question from Nora Hamel. She would know what you think about your second future scenario regarding hydrogen. I have a little problem with noise. You hear that too, Leslie? Okay, I speak a bit slower. So she wants to know: is it the role of Germany as an energy net importer in your second scenario? Is it more or less a political risk for Germany?
I see. Well, we need to be aware that we already are a net importer, and we're importing fossil fuels. And to a great degree, we're importing fossil fuels from Russia and countries in the Middle East. And there are several ways to approach this. You could think that in general, importing energy isn't such a big deal. You need to just, let's say, redistribute globally who you're working with to make it a better deal. Or you could say that it's actually a great idea to connect to a country like Russia in the future, because you need to, keep up your good connection in an economical way. So maybe importing green hydrogen from Russia could be an idea. Then again, it's not the first country that pops up on a global map of solar irradiation that you need in order to produce green hydrogen in a cheap way. But I don't think we're coming up with a new risk. I think it's generally like international trade in energy is something that I consider one of the better ways to connect globally. If it makes sense to tap into the potential that some other countries have that we don't have. So I wouldn't worry so much about future risks. I think it's a general way that that we're progressing to, because renewable energy the potential is not equally distributed. We're going to make use of most of the potential that we have in Germany, but it's not going to be enough for all energy sectors. And then making use of the renewable energy potential in other countries is I think it's a pretty good way to start relations with some of these countries, either anew or restart these connections. So no, I don't worry so much about the risk, and I think we've lived in a higher risk for a long time while we were importing fossil fuels.
Mm-hmm. Leslie, your micro. Put your micro on.
Whoops, sorry. We have another question about sort of the political, economic, or even the sort of lobby that you mentioned in your talk. It's about the German automotive industry, and the question comes from Stefan Bettin. He asks, as the German automotive sector is so important for the national economy, and therefore also for politicians, you already hinted at its role in the Energiewende dynamic. But maybe you can elaborate on how you see its role in the future. Basically, do you see EVs? Do you see hybrids, fuel cells? What's going to be the future?
Right. Yeah, that is. That's a good question. It is a bummer, right? Because, you know, you work in the auto industry in Germany and you have perfected the internal combustion engine. And then, you know, people, you know, don't want to make use of them anymore. Or as you would say, people, you know, policy or politics is forcing out, you know, your great invention and replacing it by other things. And then when you look into producing electric vehicles instead, you see how the margins are so much lower, and the value creation cannot be kept inside of Germany. When you're a politician, you're going to look at all these things. Yeah, so that is a huge transformation issue coming up there, right? And from observing what the auto industry does, they're obviously also at a loss for a solution right now. They're doing several things in Germany. They're lobbying greatly for, let's say, for cost sharing when it comes to infrastructure investment that they need for the future. So, for example, after many years of quite a stable income, when it now comes to, I don't know, let's say setting up new battery factories and subsidizing new research into electrochemical batteries and so on, they see this as a government issue to take care of, which is probably smart because it's probably going to be done. And when it comes to the infrastructure investments in public charging stations and so on, we're going to probably see at least a cost sharing of, the auto industry doing a part, but also, the public and the utilities doing a part. And they still haven't solved their biggest issue, right? Because the big issue is about it's probably two things. One is selling cars, like many cars, and also then obviously selling the kind of cars that they're making. And I also worry about number one too. So am I going to own a car in 30 years from now? Am I really going to need to own a car in 30 years from now? Because it's not only about the fact that the kind of cars are not going to be, high up on the agenda when they're, let's say, fossil based, but also I might simply not need as many cars anymore. And both of these things are very worrying to them. And number one can be solved by a few things that they're already introducing money into, like car sharing fleets that they're setting up with their own cars, right? This is why you see so many car sharing firms buy auto companies. And number two is something where they're hoping to find their share in a mix of technologies. And this is why the hybrid car comes in. This is why the fuel cell car comes in. I think because it gives them an opportunity in a market which would else be distributed to other car makers. But the question really points at a very big transformation issue, and one that is coming up in Germany in a even more significant way than in other countries, I think. Just because we have relied on the auto industry as one of the pillars of the German industry for such a long time, obviously with no vision for a future with less or different cars.
Yes, I agree. And the question is, of course, is the auto industry able to transform itself? Is it okay, we will see. I will come back to this question of potential risk of energy imports. And there's another question by Abdullah Fahimi. And the question is, what are your thoughts on Nord Stream 2?
All right. So Nord Stream 2 is a gas pipeline. And it's a project that that's on our plates for so many years now with a lot of critique, right? The idea was to connect Russia directly to Germany using this pipeline. And it doesn't make sense for several reasons. So one reason is that it's supposed to secure a supposed lag in natural gas in the future, which doesn't seem to be necessary, or it doesn't seem to be necessarily a lag, because we're not using as much natural gas right now as we thought we would use 10 or 15 years ago. That's number one. And number two is it led to a lot of confusion with our neighboring countries in the beginning, because, you could have built a pipeline in a different way, in a way that would lead to a, let's say, evenly distributed natural gas system with other countries, but it was really only a bilateral by-country connection, which wasn't really helpful. So at the time, I think when they were starting Nord Stream 2, something interesting happened with Nord Stream 2. So at the time when they started it, there was a lot of critique from the environmental groups and the eco part of the public sentiment, which made sense because from an ecological and environmental point of view, it wasn't a good idea. Today, there is a lot of critique from so many other groups, not for environmental reasons, but for, let's say, political reasons, because right now there is a strong sentiment that is, let's say, unhappy with the political moves that Russia has made over the last few years. And it's a very different group of people, but it's being heard, which is interesting because at the time, I think the environmental groups were not being heard, but the political groups right now are being heard in a more public and louder way. So it's interesting for me that they are forming an interest group right now with more power than before. And because you asked about my personal views, well, I'm not an expert on the, let's say, the contractual parts of this project, right? But I definitely think it doesn't make sense and that we don't need it, and that the German energy system will be just fine without this additional gas pipeline.
Okay, thanks, Katrin. Since you had made your talk very personal, you're going to receive a personal question now again that has to do with your personal experience in the sort of energy industry. This question comes from somebody who I don't know who it is, but it's about like your trajectory from the conventional energy industry now into the renewable energy sector. And this person asks whether your own personal move sort of reflects a trend that people might be following also because sort of the money is going in that direction, or do you think that the industry really has sort of undergone a moral change?
That's a good question. That's a very good question. Well, I'm observing that companies that I would have called conventional power companies at some point, like RWE and E.ON and so on, are now at least presenting themselves as totally into renewable energy, right? And they're investing in renewables, and their slogans now are in the range of "We're Europe's biggest renewable energy producer," or we're investing more money than anyone else into renewables every year. What does it mean? It doesn't mean that they're different companies, right? Or that their management has been totally replaced. I don't think that's what is happening, but it does mean that obviously two things might be different. One is the business case might be better for renewables, or the business case is much worse for conventional energy, which would be a good thing. And then the other thing is that it obviously makes more sense to be addressing the public with statements of this sort rather than the sort that they were using in the beginning. And I think the PR in the beginning of the conventional power industry was, let's say, save supply, save jobs, right, or something like that. That was probably the big headline at the time. So for many reasons, one good thing happened, that obviously you now have to make an economical decision towards renewable energy because of the economics of it, because of the economics of conventional power, which is a good thing. It's one of the reasons why I think also so much is happening internationally, especially. I think in most of our international projects, we can very clearly show that renewable energy system or a hybrid system with a PV and a battery or so, and a very small diesel generator will be more economical than the conventional system that would have been employed otherwise. So that is a great thing. And for the company, it means that they're also undergoing many changes, which is probably very hard. And most people that I knew that had worked in the conventional energy sector have, let's say, have relocated or have transferred to other companies over the last 10 or 12 years. But I don't see them all leaving or so. It's not like everyone is, transferring from the conventional to the renewable companies, because the renewable energy industry in Germany isn't exactly at a boom, or it hasn't really undergone a boom over the last few years either. There has been a time, and I think Rainer made very good use of that time in the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s in renewable energy in Germany. But there is lots to do to make this an even more attractive and an even more economical, future-proof business in Germany. So it's not, I wouldn't say that it's something that is such a, it's not something that you could really say people are coming, in drafts to. That's not what is happening, I don't think.
Katrin, I have a question connecting the past and the future of Energiewende. And in the past, especially in Germany, the prosuming idea was a big driver, especially in roof PV. Many people who installed roof PV, they thought about if they can't get in-feed tariffs, they can use the energy for themselves, for cars or for the households and so on. And are there any options of prosuming with green hydrogen?
Good question. What could this be? Prosuming would mean that, let's say I have my own renewable energy system, I turn it into hydrogen, and then I store it. I don't store the electricity, but I store the hydrogen, and then I use it for heating.
For example, yes.
I see. I know that I've seen this before. I've seen it in some off-grid locations internationally. For example, a green resort in Thailand is using this. It's not something that I see coming up in Germany so far, because as far as I understand, making direct use of electricity, putting it in an electrochemical battery, and then making use of it is the use case that most people would probably rather use and rather need. You always have to answer the question, what is the application that really needs the green hydrogen as opposed to the electricity, right? You need to find an application in the prosumer case that really requires hydrogen. And I'm lacking a vision for what that application could be, but maybe you have an idea.
No, it's an open question, and
okay.
What I know is only what you said is applications in off-grid, of course. But I thought about that, think about it, because this presuming idea was, I think, it was a driving moment or driving force of installing, especially PV in Germany, for many people, not only for the famous dentist who has enough money, but for farmers and so on. There are a lot of people who think it's a good idea to improve my own ability to get energy security more or less. So, but I think how can you think about that in a green hydrogen world? But I think you're right. It's applications only in the offshore world are thinkable now.
Okay, Katrin, we're not receiving any more questions from the audience.
I do see something in the chat. Have you looked at the chat?
Yeah, that is a little cryptic for me, actually. The link. I think this is an advertisement, basically, for a for something that's going on at FH Erfurt. I think it's it's a survey. Okay, this Professor Dr. Katrin Großmann is asking us to kindly take part in her survey. And the main question is, what is energy and why is it important?
That's a very good question. As I said, I deliberately decided to work in energy because I thought it would be important. It wasn't, I could have worked in IT or I don't know, electronics, consumer electronics. But I started my work in energy because I thought, I don't know, energy is obviously, one of the bases or pillars of a good life, right? It gives us flexibility in making decisions because it, lights up the street and it powers our houses and makes it warm or cold. So it gives us the opportunity to actually, make use of our lives. And I think that's the idea of what a good life is about and what capabilities are about. And also, this is something that I would say from my perspective today, it is such a vast field to be working in with so many different aspects that could be interesting. Not only the fact that you can switch from policy to trading or something, which probably the other way around you could do. I'm not sure if, I would hire you as a trader if you've worked in policy, but, you can trade stuff, you look into the world of finances and banking, and then you can go to energy policy, and then you can work for a think tank, but you could also work for a research institute like mine, and then apply your knowledge to the field of the transport sector as well as the power system sector. It's a great, playground for people that that find this, this variability interesting. And also because it has so many connections to issues of politics and society, it makes it one of the best, places to be working in, for me at least.
And there's also lots going on globally, a whole transition.
You're right. You can always, whenever that's true. Even if you have to relocate somewhere else, right? You're always going to be able to work in energy. That's a very good point. That's correct.
Okay.
So
again, thank you very much, Katrin. And thank you all for questions and discussion. And
you're very welcome.
And some of us switch to the last sessions of the conference, and maybe we see us at the farewell words and wrap up.
Yes, let me just say 2 words. We have a 10-minute break coming up, and then sessions start at 11:10. And we will finalize the conference after the sessions in a very short wrap-up of our impressions, Bert and my impressions, that are quite positive. I can already say. And yes, thanks again to you, Katrin, and I hope to see you in person next time. Who knows?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.